To welcome everyone to our building grant proposal budget. This is our last in our summer series of just looking at how to prepare grants. Hopefully you've been able to join us for some of our other sessions. I'd like to start with introducing myself. I'm Elizabeth Franco. I'm the senior grant writer at the Santa Clara County Office of Education. And with me today from our Santa Clara County Office of Education accounting team is Rebecca Slattery and Chattel Mystery. And they'll be available at the end to answer any questions you might have. We have some participants from outside of the County Office of Education, and we welcome you today. There'll be a few times where I do reference County Office of Ed processes during the presentation, and I invite you just to consider how the processes work at your district or organization when during those moments. If you can put your name and your department in the chat, that would be great so we can see who is here with us today. And I just want to remind everyone about a few Zoom best practices. Next slide, please. Please keep yourself muted to avoid distractions. And if you have any questions, please use the raise your hand button or add them to the chart at the end of the session. After the presentation is over, we will send you a copy of the slide deck and a link to the recording. Please be patient. It might take a few days for the recording of the webinar to actually get uploaded to the site. So let's go ahead and dive into our content for today. So here's what we'll be covering. We're going to start off just looking briefly at processes at the County Office of Education around budgets and grants. We're going to do an overview of budgets for grants. We'll talk about the different components that have to be included in the budgets. And then we'll briefly cover what a budget narrative is and how to complete one. Well, thank you all that have put your names in, appreciate it. So when you're preparing a grant proposal as part of the County Office of Ed, there's two teams that need to be involved in addition to your team. And the first is the Grant and Partnerships Office, which is what I and Debbie, who's helping out today, are members of. We serve as a central resource for County Office of Ed departments and divisions, providing information and support related to new competitive grants and with interagency collaborative grant applications. And the other team that's equally important is the accounting team, which works to ensure that the budget created for the grant meets all internal and external regulations. And I encourage you to let both of our teams know as early as possible when you're applying for funding, so that you can start building the relationship and build the strongest grant we can together. The accountant is a valuable resource in this process, and working with them early in preparing your proposal will create a successful partnership around the grant budget. The first time your accountant sees your budget should not be the day you're trying to submit it. They should already have reviewed and given you feedback before you submit for final approvals. And the same is for the grants and partnership team. Both of our teams want to work again to make sure that you are submitting the strongest grant possible and the most competitive grant possible. Next slide, please. So let's begin with an overview of the budget. Next slide, please. The budget is the first thing that many grant makers actually look at when they receive your grant. So it's important to have a thorough and complete budget. And your budget should be a reflection of your proposal. Everything that is in your proposal should be represented in your budget. And you want to make sure your budget is clear and realistic. It's a realistic projection of what the cost associated with your project will be. And the best person to start drafting the budget is actually the person who understands the project best. They should start by listing everything that needs to be included in the budget. And then after they have that basic foundation of the budget, then reaching out to their accountant and other team members to help build it into a full budget. Another note here I want to point out before we go any further is it's really important that your narrative and your proposal tell the same story. If your proposal mentions things that you want to do that aren't even recognized in the budget, that's a red flag to your funder that your planning is weak and you may not have thought everything through, and it could keep you from getting funded. So I will say it many times, but make sure that your proposal, the narrative, and the budget match and are aligned. So how do we get started? So first of all, when a grant is released, you either get a request for proposal or request for applications. You want to read it thoroughly. And I know that some of these applications are very long, but everything you really need to know is in it. So read it thoroughly. If they offer a webinar, attend the webinar. When you're looking specifically at the budget section, you want to read it and use the formatting that they require for the grant. And then there's a couple other suggestions here. Expenses must be allowed by the funding source. That information is in the budget section of the proposal. Use whole dollars. Don't make up numbers, get real costs for items. In your budget narrative, you actually have to show where you got those costs from and why you're including them. So again, don't make up numbers, and as you're researching, keep note of them. And this is really important in the area that our accountants are the experts. All expenses have to align with federal and or state legislation, regulations, and guidance. And again, our accountants know those much better than we do, so we want to make sure that we're using their expertise in that area. And then the last thing I want to point out is this concept called supplement versus supplant. Federal law actually prohibits recipients of federal funds from replacing state, local, or agency funds with federal funds. Funds coming from the federal government, and oftentimes those funds then come through the state, so the state has the same rule. They should supplement your existing efforts, not supplant them. Next slide, please. Okay, so a budget, there's three things it has to be. It has to be reasonable. This means the costs that you're including in your budget don't exceed ordinary and necessary costs incurred under normal circumstances. So you don't want to inflate or underinflate costs. Use what is appropriate for your geographical location. And here, of course, in Santa Clara County, our costs for lots of items might be more expensive than other parts of the country or other state. So we want to make sure we're using the ones that are appropriate for our region. Costs also have to be allocable. And what that means, you can only include costs that are described in your narrative as project activities. You can't include things that aren't included in your project. And finally, allowable. That means that they conform to any limitations that the funder has given you or any exclusions that the funder has given you. And then there's some costs that are always unallowable. These include alcohol, lobbying, entertainment, organized fundraising. Those costs are always unallowable and you won't want to include those there. I highly recommend making sure your accountant not only you don't only work with them, but let them see the RFA. I one time totally missed on a grant that I was working on that you couldn't include certain costs. And luckily the accountant had reviewed it and she noticed my mistake and we were able to fix it in plenty of time. So if you're unsure about any guidelines or legislation, check in with your accountant, have them review what the proposal is asking. If between the two of you can't figure out the answer, you can always reach out to the program officer from the funder. Pretty much every RFA has a contact person listed in them that you can go ask questions. And oftentimes they even have set technical assistance hours is what they call them, where you can call in, Zoom in, and ask your questions, and then they will help you out. So let's move to budget components. What is needed in a budget? So each grant maker is different. I've said that in my last presentation, I'll say that again today. These are just examples. You'll have to, of course, read the proposal that you're applying to and follow what they want. But in most budgets, it's going to be a one-page summary of your financial projections, and it will break down, you're going to break down your project income as well as your expenses. And we're going to get a little more in depth into those as we continue, but I want to just briefly give you the overview of what these different components are. So expenses are how much your project costs. One way to think about this is if you didn't have this project, you wouldn't have these costs, okay? We can break expenses into direct expenses and indirect ones. Direct costs are directly related to your specific project, meaning these expenses are used for this project only. And this will include personnel costs as well as non-personnel costs. We also have something called indirect costs. This is your overhead. And again, I'll go into this a little bit more later on, but note that not all funders allow for indirect costs, and most funders have a cap on how much those costs can be. And then the other major component is your income. This is what is supporting your support and revenue. So now that you know the basic components, let's talk about them in more detail as we go through putting together a budget proposal. I want to start off with personnel costs. Just as a side note, please remember that everything we talk about in terms of this budget, you have to, in your budget narrative, explain. So I'll be revisiting that concept, but as you're putting together these thoughts and asking these questions, you'll want to be able to explain them in your narrative section of the budget. So personnel costs will likely be the largest component of your budget. And you need to use this part to give the funder confidence that you're going to adequately staff the project to ensure that you meet your results. So here's a couple questions to consider when you're thinking about your personnel cost with the budget. The first is, what type of staffing is needed to be successfully staff the project? Of your current staff, how much time would they need to dedicate to this project? And will they be able to fulfill their current duties when adding on this additional role? If not, do you need to use grant funds to hire staff to make the project successful? Or if so, how much time will they need to dedicate to the project to make it successful? And is it better to overestimate the amount of time you will need rather than underestimate it and not be able to complete the project successfully? Next slide, please. So how do you figure out personnel costs? Great question. So County Office of Ed and any district has what they call a salary schedule that you can use. And it's usually posted on their website, or you can get it through the HR department if needed. You can use the salary schedule to figure out what the salary is of the particular position. You also need to include benefits. And for County Office of Ed, we have a fringe benefits calculator on the intranet that you can use to figure out what the benefits would be for a year of salary. A big asterisk here. If you're working on a multi-year grant, you want to make sure your accountant is helping you do this, because there are many different steps and COLAs and different things that change a salary from year to year. So your accountants are great partners in developing a multi-year grant around salaries. So what about if you're hiring a new position and it's not someone that already exists? The HR department will also have, and then actually on the internet as well, job descriptions. And you'll want to look at see if any of those job descriptions meet the need of this grant. And if not, then you need to work with the HR team to determine what level the position that you might be opening would be, so that you can figure out where they would fit on the salary schedule and project out their costs. So other personnel, sometimes people think about professional experts or contractors. They actually are not listed under personnel costs and will be listed in the contracts line. But I do want to note that if you are going to be utilizing professional experts or independent contractors, you do want to work with the HR team to determine compensation levels, and to keep in mind that all contracts have to abide by procurement procedures. So let's go ahead and do a sample budget, starting with the personnel costs. So the first thing you want to do is, first of all, I always start off using an Excel sheet or Google Sheets. List in your personnel cost who is going to be included in this budget. For this example, we're going to have a director 3, a coordinator, and an administrative assistant 2. Next slide, please. You want to figure out what percentage of their time is going to be dedicated to the project. You want to add that information to your spreadsheet. So in this one, 10% for the director, 50% for the coordinator, and 100% for the administrative assistant. Next slide, please. Then using the salary schedule, you're going to put in the amount of what their full FTE, full-time equivalent salary would be. So in this case, the director salary is $145,000. And then you're going to multiply that by the amount of time, percentage of time they're actually going to spend on this grant. So as you can see, the director 3 is going to be $14,500 for the year of grant. The coordinator is 50% of their full-time FTE is going to be $60,000. And the administrative assistant, all their salary is going to come from this grant. So we have their whole amount there. Next slide, please. So then we want, on your grant, you also have to have your fringe benefit costs, and these are separated from your salary. So we're going to take the salary amount that we have for each position. So the director we said was going to be $14,000 a year, the coordinator $60,000, and the administrative $60,000. And then we're going to multiply that by their percentage of fringe benefits cost. And these are purely examples. So in the case of the director, 35% of their costs are going to be their benefits. So we're just multiplying that 35% times the amount of salary that's going to be spent by this grant for this position to come up with $5,000.75. And you'll do that for each of the positions and then subtotal those. And that will be your fringe benefits. And then if we put it all together, hopefully you can all see this, we get a total personnel cost of $185,875. Okay. So now the non-personnel costs. So this is what we call everything else. Every project is different, so every budget is going to be different. This is just a sample list of non-personnel costs to get you started. In some budget forms, you will list out every cost, while in others, you're going to clump all of them together into one line item. Think of every possible expense you might have and include as many of the potential costs and incidental costs as you can think of. A common mistake made by new budgeters is to forget something. So it's helpful to look at a sample list like this one, or to ask more experienced team members if they can review it and give you any hints of things you might have forgotten. Next slide, please, Debbie. So we're going to look at travels first. And travel is kind of the most complicated because there is lots of guidelines set by public agencies such as the County Office of Ed or districts around travel policies. So you want to make sure you're aware of what those policies are. You also need to review the grant guidelines to make sure you're following any limits that they might put on travel. And if you have any questions about travel costs, your accountants are a great resource for you. When deciding what you're going to put in travel, you want this to match what you have in your narrative. If you have included field work, collaborative professional meetings, annual conferences, any of those kind of events that activities that need travel, you want to now budget out how much money it will cost to do that. That would include mileage, per diem, rental car, airfare, hotel if needed. And you're going to get all those costs figured out. And as I mentioned before, get real costs and make sure you know what your sources are so that when you get to your budget narrative, you can explain where you got these costs from. Next slide, Debbie. Supplies and equipment. Each funder has a different definition of supplies and equipment and what is allowable. Read the application thoroughly. Some grants clearly state that funds cannot be used for specific things such as technology, equipment, or capital costs. Also, there's some items that would fall under indirect costs. So such things as phone, postage, supplies, copies, those are considered indirect costs unless they're specific for your project. So for example, if you are going to be printing out a training manual to use for participants that you're going to be making multiple copies of, that can be put in this part of the budget. But if you're just going to be printing off an agenda for a meeting, that would not be included in here. Also, supplies tend to be things that are used once, and equipment tends to be things that are used multiple times, just to kind of clarify. But again, read what the funders have written and how they have defined each of these categories. Okay, next slide. Contracts. Contracts include costs for professional experts, independent contractors, which I mentioned earlier. Also, if there's a subcontract with another agency, or if there's internal contracts, which we at County Office of Ed called IOSAs. These items will all be combined into one line item for the budget page, but in your budget narrative, you would explain each cost separately and how those costs are justified. I just want to make a quick note about subcontractors. If you're doing a grant and you're subcontracting out to another agency, usually the funder is going to want additional paperwork or documents about what that subcontract looks like. Please read the proposal thoroughly on that and make sure you include whatever they ask for. And then a separate note about IOSAs. If you're going to be doing an IOSA with any of our internal teams here, which might include evaluation, data governance, data zone, website, translation or interpretation or trainers, you want to reach out to those departments and get the cost estimate from them and make sure that they're giving you a budget that shows how that money is going to be used so that you have that again for the grant. Believe it or not, some grants actually want you to include all those forms in your submission in addition to just the narrative. Okay, so let's move on to indirect costs. Indirect costs are the cost of doing business. Many times they are equated with an iceberg, the top being the direct cost for the project, the ice underwater being all the indirect costs that sustain the project and your entire organization. And you can see a list of what some of these costs are on this slide. Next slide, please. So how do you know what your indirect cost rate is? Well, if you work for a school district or the County Office of Ed, it is decided each year by the state of California, and it changes every July 1st. If you are working for a nonprofit agency, then you would work with your accounting department to figure out your indirect cost rate. And of course, you want to keep in mind, many grants have a threshold or a maximum amount you can put for your indirect costs, so you never want to go above that. If you work at County Office of Ed and the indirect cost threshold is lower than what we usually charge for indirect costs, then you want to make sure that your supervisor as well as your accountant is aware of this. And if awarded the grant, there will be a separate form that you would need to be filling out around indirect costs. Okay, so let's move back to our example. Oh, sorry. Now we're going to shift over to income. So your income also needs to be laid out in the grants. This again may vary. This is mostly usually what I see with foundation grants and not as much with state or federal grants, but you would show what income you have from other grants, such from government, foundations, corporations, or individual gifts. And then under your earned income, if you're charging fees for any of your programs, you would include that. And again, this is just for the project, not for the entire organization. So let's say you're doing an after-school program and the Pfizer Foundation is giving you $30,000 to help support this program. And you've got a Santa Clara County grant for another $20,000. You would include that in here. And then you would add all that up to show your income. Next slide, please. The match. So some grants require a match, and this will be listed in the proposal. I've seen grant proposals that ask up to a 50% match. So I really encourage you to talk to your supervisor before you apply for a grant to see if the match is really something that's doable for you, and have that conversation before you start really working on the grant. Another thing about matching funds is that we are responsible, or you are, if you get the money, you are responsible for managing and tracking matching funds with the same rigor that you are the grant funds. So for government grants, you only want to show a match if it's required. For private grants, it's a little bit different. Showing matches is a way to show that other organizations and other funders are invested in your program and project. So it's often seen as a plus, even if it's not required. And matches don't always have to be cash matches. It can be personnel time. So if we're working for a grant and your director is going to work on the grant 10% of their time, but they're going to cover that time from another funding source, then that could be seen as a match. It can also be volunteers, donated goods, services, etc. If a match is required and you are part of the County Office of Ed, please note that any matches have to be approved by the Director of Internal Business Services. They have the oversight and they need to make sure that we're not using the same match twice, and that all other regulations, federal, state, and local, are followed in that match. So please make a note of that. So let's move on to the budget narrative. And what is a budget narrative? I've kind of alluded to this several times already, but this is where you're actually going to clearly explain what each line in your budget is. You're going to justify what those costs are, that they're reasonable, that they're appropriate, and they're adequate. You're going to share how you found those costs. If there's a policy involved with it, such as the travel, you would state that your travel policy from Santa Clara County Office of Education says that you're allowed to spend this much and this much, and that's what governs your decision on this. You're going to provide your details about what items are going to be purchased. You're going to show how you calculated your costs. And just as importantly is you're going to make sure that your budget narrative is consistent with what your proposal is all about. Okay. So we do have 2 teams that are ready to help you make sure that all those things happen. And that is, again, the accounting teams and the grants and partnership team. So your accountants are available to assist you with early draft. They can answer questions. If you're not sure, ask them. And they will review both the budget and the budget narrative to make sure that it makes sense and that it's following all rules and regulations as needed by law. And then the grants and partnership team will review the budget narrative, and the main narrative to make sure that all the pieces are lined up and aligned and making sense. So I really encourage you to make sure that you're sending these out to the GPO grants and partnership team and the county team several days before the submittal date, so that you have time to make any updates or changes as needed. And just a quick word before we go to questions. If you're awarded the grant, then there are certain accounting forms that you would need to get started with the process, which include a grant approved form, a lower indirect cost form, and a salary account change form. Those are all on the intranet. And if you have questions about those, make sure you reach out to your accountant. Also, when you're awarded a grant, it does have to go through risk management before that grant can be signed off and approved. And the last thing is, just because you got the grant doesn't mean you stop worrying about the budgets. Your budget is actually a project management tool that you would use the entire time of the grant. You have to keep track of the funds. You have to keep the funder appraised of your actual costs versus your projected cost. Sometimes these are quarterly during the grant, sometimes they're just at the end of the grant. But you have to be accountable for the funds that you are, sorry, next slide, Debbie, sorry. The funds that you have spent. And really importantly is we recognize that sometimes there's variances between what you initially thought you were going to use the money for and then what comes down to being using the money for. Any changes have to be approved by your funder. When in doubt, ask. If something comes up, such as unanticipated expenses, or you won't be able to spend the money as budgeted, you need to get that approval, especially if it's a government grant in any way. You do not want to have any financial mismanagement that leaves a black mark with that funder. And trust me, the funders talk to each other. So everyone would know if you were not financially using your money correctly. So I know that was a lot of information. I want to give you all a chance to ask any questions, especially since we have Sheetal and Rebecca here. If for some reason you don't want to stay for questions and answers, I have put a link in the chat for a quick survey. We are trying to build this learning series into something stronger and better, so any feedback you give us is appreciated. I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anybody have their hand raised or want to ask a question about any of the budget components or any of the processes? Okay, so as I mentioned previously, last slide, please. We are going to send out a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides that you'll get sometime this afternoon. It may take a few days in order to get the recording up there, so please be patient with that. If you have any questions about writing grants or want to connect with myself, my email is up here, and as well as our grants office email. I think I really just want to stress again that the accounting team and the grants partnership team is here to support you in this process. And we can support you best if you include us as early as possible in the process and not the day before it's due. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Appreciate you joining us and enjoy the rest of your week. Take care.